Communitech helps companies start, grow, and succeed. Our members raise 19% more capital, raise more rounds, hold more patents, and have an increased financial velocity. Communitech member companies scale faster than anywhere else in Canada. So if you're not a Communitech member yet, let's fix that. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Ask Me Anything session. My name is Christina Wood, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Just as a reminder, this session will be recorded and available on our AMA webpage at communitech.ca. I also wanted to mention that today's Ask Me Anything session is the first in a series of 3 sessions we are running in partnership with Invest Ottawa and Mars. Please check out our hybrid worksite for registration information on the upcoming AMAs. So on Thursday, September 23rd and Wednesday, October 6th. And with that, I would like to welcome today's speaker, Neena Gupta. I'm so excited to have Neena back with us. She's hosted a few AMAs in the past, and she'll be speaking to what it means for COVID-19 vaccinations in the return to office. So thank you so much, Neena, for being here, and I will turn it over to you to further introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a special welcome to our guests that are coming through Invest Ottawa and Mars, because that's a new experience for me, Christina. I'm a partner at Gowling WLG. Gowling WLG is a Canadian firm with offices across Canada and with affiliate offices across the globe. So we are very happy to partner with you. I focus on, as I say, practical employment law advice. Today's AMA is a really interesting and topical AMA in that we're dealing with return to work and we are dealing with vaccinations. I can't obviously give specific legal advice, and I just want to throw in a few legal cautions. Number one, my perspective is as an Ontario called lawyer. And so if you're listening in from another part of the country or doing business in another part of the country or the globe, obviously there could be different laws that apply. Secondly, again, I'm focusing mostly on really the Communitech space, which tends to be smaller private companies that are not unionized, that are mostly in Ontario. So if you're, again, maybe a larger company, a unionized company, or federally regulated, there may be some variations on the themes. So obviously consult with your own lawyer or contact us before you make any specific discussions. Thanks, Christina.
Yeah, thanks for making that clear. So yeah, we're happy to offer guidance today on generalities. If you would like specific advice, please reach out to Neena directly, or you can reach out to your Communitech CSM or advisor, and we'll get you connected with the right resource. Following today's presentation, we'll also share a few resource slides that Neena has put together to help companies navigate this uncertain time. So just wanted to highlight some of the topics we're planning to cover today. So we've had a number of questions come pouring in. And so these are kind of the 5 high-level themes that we'll be looking at. So I'll be asking Neena to answer a bunch of questions that have already come in. And then if we haven't gotten to something that you're curious about, please remember to put it in the Q&A. You can also upvote questions there, and we'll get to as many as we can in the hour. We also have Stacey Dunlop, our Director of HR with Communitech, here today. So if you do have any questions specific to Communitech's vaccination policy or what we're doing for tenants, staff, and visitors, please feel free to ask those questions as well. And Stacey's happy to provide her input as well. So with that, we will get into today's discussion. Thanks, Lori. You can stop sharing slides. So Neena, I think that, the biggest question on people's minds, or the one we saw the most come in, is, can I ask employees and or job applicants if they are vaccinated or for their vaccination status?
So in Ontario, in general, you can ask for that information. An employee can choose not to provide it to you. You can't force them to give it. So our advice has always been, you ask the information either of a job applicant or an employee, and you take it that they are not vaccinated if they indicate that they're not prepared to disclose that to you. So that's how you essentially run it. So, you'll see those, yes, no, prefer not to answer. And a prefer not to answer is treated as, no, you're not vaccinated, because we can't verify it.
Okay. And so for those who are vaccinated, can you ask for proof of vaccination?
Yes, you can. In general, in the private sector, you can, again, ask for that. There's no prohibition against asking for that kind of verification. And again, if they refuse to provide it, you should treat them as if they have not provided the vaccination proof, or that they are not vaccinated.
Does same go for like event attendees or other visitors that may be entering your office space?
Yes, in general, and so if you're creating an event and it's a voluntary event, like no one's compelled to show up, so concert, hockey games, football games, parties, you can essentially, as the host and the person who controls the property, choose to have rules. And one of the rules can be you must provide proof of vaccination to attend.
Okay. Can you speak a little bit to collecting this type of information, where and how to store it?
That is the great question. That's, the devil's in the detail, Christina. So first of all, regardless of whether or not you should or you can, you should always treat any kind of medical information with a degree of care. And so what I tell people who practice HR is it's not uncommon for us to ask for medical information. So if somebody's looking to, take a leave of absence because they need an operation, we can get a medical certificate. So look to your existing practices with respect to how you store that information. Maybe you've got a special place in your HRIS system. In the good old days, there used to be a locked cabinet with separate paper file folders for people's medical information. And the only person who had the key to that was the manager of HR or his or her substitute. In your HRI systems, you can create places which has certain information that some people can get and other people cannot get. So you set your permissions. A more interesting question to me, Christina, is what can you do with the information? So yeah, you can use it for yourself, right? Like, okay, you prove that you have vaccinations, so you can come to my event, you can come to my workplace. But a much more difficult issue is, what if customers are saying, well, only send me somebody who's double vaccinated? I get this all the time. I had this conversation today because I'm looking for some movers to help me. I want them to be double vaccinated or fully vaccinated to come into my workplace. What should you do in terms of disclosing that information? And I think in Ontario, Christina, the best practice is to be really upfront. Make it clear why you're asking for the information and how you're going to use that information, and actually figure out a way of doing an online consent form. An online consent form theoretically is pretty well the same as doing, like one of those click-through software downloads. Like, you agree that we can use this information, we're going to use it in this way. And also, thankfully, someday this COVID thing is going to be in the past. We're going to delete all that information because we don't need it anymore. So those are some of the parameters around collecting that information, but more importantly, how do you use it and how do you disclose it?
Okay, that's great. The other question that's come in is about, can we use this information if we disclose that that's how we're going to use it in making decisions about, an employee's work location or any of those types of things?
Yeah, so, we've all gone through a huge upheaval about work location. The vast majority of the people on this call are probably working from home, largely, maybe not. I can see, Christina, that you're probably at home and not in the lovely Communitech offices. So yes, you can use that information to determine whether or not certain people are going to come back into the office. It doesn't actually say you can fire them, but you might say, you know what, if you're not vaccinated or you can't get vaccinated, why don't you stay at home? And you're doing it from a risk mitigation, health and safety perspective. It's safer for them because then they're not commuting, they're not exposing themselves to a vast number of people. And of course, they're less likely. There's no guarantees with this COVID, as you know, but they're less likely to be a asymptomatic transmitter of disease. So yes, you can within reason. Much more difficult, though, Christina, are the people who aren't privileged like us, who can't work from home. What happens if you have people who refuse to get double vaccinated, who refuse to disclose their status, and you now have a growing demand from customers saying, well, I don't want a technician to come into our place unless they're vaccinated. I don't want them to fix our condominium unit unless they're vaccinated. And you're now finding that you don't have work for them to do. That's where it becomes much more difficult.
Do you have guidance around how to handle that?
Yeah, I tend to treat them very carefully, but it essentially and there is some risk to it. I mean, we're on the cutting edge. There's a lot of stuff that hasn't been determined by the courts or the tribunals yet, but I tend to understand our customers are requiring this. If they're not requiring it and we can place you, we'll give you those jobs. But if not, we may have to lay you off or put you on an unpaid leave of absence. I've had actually one client make the very tough decision that if someone's unable to be vaccinated, and it's not a protected reason. And what I mean by that is there's not an illness, human rights issue, or religious creed issue. It's a person who believes that they don't want to get vaccinated. They've made the decision that they'll terminate that person, but it's not necessarily cause. So they've actually made the decision to pay out this person and take that person off the payroll in order to make room for a new person who will comply with the health and safety guidelines. It's a very difficult decision to make. It is, in my view, the last decision you want to make. In other words, you want to look for ways of avoiding that. Is there a way of putting them on leave? I mean, we've got to get out of this COVID-19 at some point in time. And maybe all we need is a leave of absence until that person can do it. Is there some work they could be doing from home? Is there some clients who don't really care because the work's being done, overnight and there's nobody there anyway? Is there something we can do to keep the person working?
Got it. We do have a couple of questions that have come in the Q&A. So one is, can we be liable in any way based on these decisions? So for example, can we be liable if we don't mandate vaccines and somebody gets COVID-19? So kind of the opposite.
Right. So interesting, right? So we as employers have a duty to maintain health and safety. The province has not required us to have mandatory vaccines in the ordinary workplace. It's different if you're in a long-term care or hospice, palliative care type of setting. But the vast majority of people on this call, I recognize some of the names, they're not in that setting. And so we now will have a real issue of, well, we didn't mandate vaccines and people got really sick. I think it's a bit of a stretch if we did everything else right. And what I mean by that is the daily screening, the 6 feet, the plexiglass shields, the hand washing stations. I think it's a bit of a stretch to say, oh, an employer is liable because there must have been work transmission. Christina, there's the other thing that's really interesting is not all of our people on this call will be members of the workers' compensation system. And of course, we have to go back to basics, but you can't sue your employer if you're in the workers' comp system for a workplace injury. You have to make a claim through WSIB for premiums and benefits. So I'm not as worried about an employee in the workplace pointing the finger. I'm more worried about the moral obligation we have to do the best we can to keep people safe, and how do we keep people safe in the presence of a pretty nasty infectious virus that just doesn't seem to want to go away. And Christina, I was one of these people who thought, 2-4 weeks we'll be back to normal. So yes, I was very wrong about that, right?
Yeah, when you were mentioning, football games and parties, I was like, what are those? I forget. So, talking about return to office and, current guidance from the province and, WSIB and other things, are we still in a work from home mandate, meaning that we should have employees working from home if you can? What are some other guidance or suggestions from the province that we can use as a guide?
Yeah, so we are in stage 3. So stage 3 essentially says businesses can be open, but there are reduced capacity limits. So we have to follow that. So I really recommend, as you're looking through your workplace, and I went into our workplace about a month ago and it looked really sorry because nobody had been there for such a long time, is really think about some of the basics, which is ventilation, right? Cleaning, all of those 6 feet spacing, hand sanitizing. How are you going to do that daily, check? Is it going to be an app? Is it going to be something that a screen that people fill in as they go in? And scheduling. So many of our clients have essentially said, we're not comfortable because our physical space is such, it's really hard to do that 6-foot distancing. And not everybody is set up, Christina, like an old-fashioned law firm where everybody's got offices and large cubicles. Remember, think about, the Communitech audience. We're agile, we sit on long desks, we share ideas. It's a much more intimate workplace than maybe I grew up with. And so how do we manage all those protocols in a workplace that was actually designed to foster those serendipitous connections? So people are thinking about, scheduling shifts, and planning things so that maybe we're not going to be back to 100% for a long time, but at least we can start bringing people back. As part of that, I think there's going to be a number of people, whether it's because they can't get vaccinated or they have other issues in their life, who will want to remain working from home. And I'm really going to encourage this audience to move away from the old model where the presumption was you had to work in the office and move to a model about how can we facilitate a collaborative workplace, even though some people may not be in the physical space. I think we've learned a lot, Christina, to make that kind of hybrid return to work more likely. And if I could just do a quick shout out, so don't blush. Communitech has put in a really nice, I thought, a very comprehensive and quite frankly thoughtful return to work handbook, and it sort of takes you through the thinking that you should be doing as you're planning a return to work. And it doesn't mandate or prescribe that it has to be 100% or 50% or hybrid, but I thought the analysis in that return to work handbook would be very helpful for your audience. So if somebody can throw it in the chat, or maybe Christina, you could arrange to circulate the link after this. I would really recommend that as a great workbook to go through that process of returning to work in the workplace.
Yeah, thanks, Neena. We'll definitely have somebody from the team add that into the chat. We'll circulate it as part of our post-event email. We also have, an FAQ document and some other things that we can share along with the resource slides that you've put together, Neena. So thank you. Another question here: under health and safety, can an employee refuse work because they feel the work environment is unsafe due to COVID?
Yes, they can absolutely do that, but understand how that works. So COVID is treated exactly like any other work refusal. So whatever the appropriate process is in your workplace, and depending on the size, you may have a health and safety committee, or you may have a subcommittee that deals with work refusals, or it's just a rep. But in any event, it's like any other work refusal. What do I mean with that? If somebody refuses to use a miter saw because there's not a proper guard, there's a process for work refusal. If somebody refuses to go up on the roof to do something because there isn't proper tie-offs, that's a work refusal due to health and safety. And finally, of course, if somebody feels fear because of COVID-19, that's also just an ordinary work refusal. Ultimately, what happens if somebody refuses to work because they think it's not safe, that the workplace hasn't done enough, it actually goes to a Ministry of Labor officer who will come and do a site visit and make a determination about whether it's an unsafe workplace. Now, in the last 19 months, we've had lots of work refusals, and I have to say, in general, the Ministry of Labor has supported the employer if really what somebody has is an inchoate fear about going back into the workplace, right? Like there's a generalized anxiety, and we need to really respect that, because we've had millions of people die, people get sick. It's an invisible enemy. So if there was anything designed to make people anxious, COVID-19 certainly, meets all the check boxes. So people are anxious, and you need to respect that. So yes, there is a work refusal process that is set forth in the Occupational Health and Safety in the Ministry of Labor. You can just look it up, or if I get organized, I'll try to send it to you, the work refusal process, and you can share that. But in general, for the kinds of employers you have here, Christina, which often are tech companies with a software, less of a manufacturing type of situation, one of the ways of reducing anxiety is to show that you have taken this risk very seriously, that you've consulted with the right experts, and these are all the steps that you're taking in order to mitigate risk. And there are some people who have very high susceptibilities. Like, there's a reason why they're anxious. Maybe they're recovering from a disease. I have two clients who are in the throes of fighting a very nasty cancer, which involves auto bone transfers, and part of that is they wipe out your own immune system. So they're as vulnerable as they can get. So when those types of people come to you and say, I don't feel comfortable venturing outside of my dining room, that's a different kind of discussion, and you need to be very respectful. They may actually have a right to be accommodated in a way that the rank and file employee doesn't have.
Got it. Yeah, definitely. It seems to be very case by case, right? You can't just kind of make one blanket statement. You got to kind of be willing to look at each individual situation.
Absolutely.
Another question here in the Q&A, and I think it kind of touches on one of our other themes, is really around, can we make hiring decisions based on vaccination status? So when we're looking to bring on new employees or interview employees, thoughts there?
So an employer can impose any criteria that is appropriate for their business, subject to the Ontario Human Rights Code. So you could have a general requirement that employees be vaccinated, but you would still have a duty to accommodate if somebody could actually not get vaccinated due to, and it's largely disability and illness, so somebody's allergic or is undergoing a treatment, and so they're not stable enough for the doctor to take that additional level of risk. And there are, I understand, religious or creed objections that you might have to look at, but subject to those human rights restrictions, you can actually impose that criteria on new employees. And I would recommend that you actually make it clear in your offer letter that the employment is subject to proof of vaccination.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And is it possible, like, should companies be considering offering an incentive to have folks get vaccinated, either new employees or existing?
So I certainly, when vaccinations became available first, so when we started to see vaccinations, I think for the general public in I think it's in late March or early April, I was strongly encouraging vaccination policies. And so you would see incentives that would include some of the practical stuff. Some people will have quite a nasty reaction to the vaccine. I can tell you that my second vaccine, the day after, I don't know that I moved 20 feet. It was just, I couldn't work. So, for a lot of employees who are hourly employees, that loss of a day's income is bad. So I strongly encourage people to expand their sick leave policy and make it very clear that that would be reimbursed. So I don't call that a vaccine incentive, but it's kind of something that people don't think about and should think about. Secondly, we made it very clear way before the province of Ontario amended their Employment Standards Act legislation that time off for vaccine was considered to be a compensable reason. So it was a paid leave to go and get your vaccine appointment. Thirdly, absolutely, if you want to give some kind of, I know companies that gave financial incentives, whether that was like a $50 gift card or a $100 gift card to go get your vaccine. And there's a theoretical objection saying, well, that's not fair. What if I can't get a vaccine? Fine. If somebody has a medical certificate that they can't get a vaccine, fine, give them the $100 certificate. But you know what's interesting? Of the thousands of people I know that did some kind of incentive, they had two inquiries about, well, what if I can't get the vaccine? What can I be eligible to? And then one very innovative employer said, if we can get to 90%, we're going to have a party. And so, funded like a fun Zoom party with all the bells and whistles, because that was still at a time where you couldn't have more than X number of people, but it gave people a collective goal. So if we can get double vaccinated by such and such a date, we'll do that. So all of those incentives are ideas or toolkits to incentivize. But I'm going to say something, Christine. I think that might have been more useful April, May, June, July. I think that the people now who have not been vaccinated fall into two or three buckets. One is people who do have genuine reasons to be concerned and need to be careful. That's a very small bucket. That's maybe 1 or 2% of the population. There's a much larger bucket of people who either have, I would say, philosophical objections to being vaccinated or told what to do, or don't believe in vaccines. And that's a very large bucket. And then there's a bucket of people, maybe not a big one for this audience, who just have lives that are very difficult. So they are, they're barely keeping it together, and it's just very hard for them to get organized. And you'll hear about vaccine clinics moving into certain kinds of postal codes or certain kinds of apartment buildings because it's just so difficult. And I keep thinking of my mother who passed away, who had crippling arthritis. And so for her to get to any medical appointment and line up was just so very difficult, even though obviously she's somebody who should be vaccinated. So that's another bucket that we tend to forget, because Communitech tends to be young and startup and a different audience, but there's a bucket of those. And so different strategies need to be used for each of those buckets, right?
Right. I'm going to turn over to the Q&A again. We have a number of questions being upvoted there. So first one here, we've talked about, can you terminate an employee who hasn't been vaccinated? Can an employer terminate an employee for spreading vaccination misinformation to other employees in the workplace?
So I'm going to rephrase the question just a little bit. So remember, in general, in a non-unionized workplace, an employer can terminate an employee at any time. The issue is whether you can terminate them for cause or whether you're writing them a large check. So I would actually say that spreading vaccine misinformation, you should deal with a warning. Number one is you are not like to spread this misinformation. And if you do, you'll be terminated. Warning number two, and then terminate. Whether or not a judge is going to say that's enough cause in the middle of a pandemic is we don't have that case law. I'm hoping a judge will say, look, they're speaking against a health and safety policy that is an employer health and safety policy and the province's health and safety policy. And therefore, it's no different than, any other grumbling employee. You get to do, strike one, strike two, and you're out. But if you're thinking about terminating somebody for something like this, you will have to talk to your lawyer, because I'm going to recommend it's going to be politically sensitive. And there's not surprisingly, for the people who oppose vaccine, there's a group that is politicizing and publicizing decisions like this. So we want to be very careful if you're going to actually terminate somebody and make it impossible for them to earn a living.
Got it. Are companies that require employees to get vaccinated likely to be liable for claims if it turns out later that the vaccine has long-term harmful effects?
Probably not. And in fact, I'm fairly strong saying employers are unlikely to be held liable. So why is that? The number one responsibility for the safety of a vaccine does not run on the employer. It's based on the producers of the vaccine. So the Pfizers, the Modernas, the AstraZeneca. So claims with respect to vaccine liability are likely to be against the vaccine companies, and as opposed to an employer saying, look, as part of our health and safety, we require you to be vaccinated. We know that nothing that we take, whether it's an aspirin or an Aleve, is 100% safe for 100% of the population 100% of the time. So you will find that there are people who have vaccine reactions that are much more severe than me being, waylaid for 24 hours. And so where I can see a much more interesting claim is, well, you made this part of work, and therefore it was, I can see like the WSIB type of claim saying, and I lost time because of it. But if you're saying 25 years from now, the vaccine turns out to have some kind of, side effect that we're not aware of, I don't think employers are going to be held liable, because the employee would have to show that the employer knew or ought to have known or was negligent about the side effects. And if it's something we don't know about now, it's very hard to pin that on the employer. So I think that fear is not a big fear. And I can see, quite frankly, governments essentially creating blanket legislation. The Ford government had blanket legislation saying, we're not going to allow companies to be sued for COVID transmission if they follow as the rules as we know them to be. I can see blanket legislation for vaccination. What I'd really like to see is a public policy, quite frankly, since we know that vaccinations cannot be 100% effective 100% of the time for 100% of people, that for the rare side effects, people who really suffer, there should be some no-fault compensation system. And we see that in Quebec. I'd love to see that in Ontario.
Thank you for that. Moving on to the next question here. What if an employee doesn't want to work with an unvaccinated employee, even though all the protocols are in place and precautions have been taken on behalf of the employer?
So I would say you should treat that very much like a work refusal. Christina, we were talking about like working through it. And there may be things we can do. Like we do have, as I said, there's that one employee that I know that can't get vaccinated, and they made arrangements for that person to have a proper office that's with a closed door, and that's where the person works. So, kind of reducing the risk. And I think a good communication about how all the pillars that we're using, including maybe additional filtration, can be of assistance, and we can require the person. I mean, we're all supposed to be supposed to be masked, but we may have a requirement that everybody use surgical masks, because cloth masks, while good, are not as good as some of the surgical quality masks. So there are things we can do to help assuage it, but I don't think that's a legitimate reason, as long as you're keeping that 6 to 10 feet apart.
Okay. Along that same theme, can we ask employees for permission to share their vaccination status with coworkers? So we talked a little bit about, like, if a customer requests that a double vaccinated person come into their home versus an unvaccinated person, can we share vaccination status with coworkers?
So I would say you should make it very clear that that's going to be one of the uses that you're going to use. So that's the right way to deal with it. So, that's appropriate. You might want to share it with public health if there's a concern about exposure. So I can't, I would think that that's a perfectly, but if you have a policy like some companies is nobody's coming into the office unless they're double vaccinated, you work from home, you impliedly are everyone's disclosing their vaccine status. Because if I show up to coffee Monday morning, you can make an inference that I went through the hoops like you did.
Got it. Perfect. A couple more here. Are we able to ask people why they fall within the Human Rights Code of exemptions? So do they have to be specific as to why they're choosing not to get a vaccine?
So I would say that all of the companies here should have some kind of accommodation policy. So think about somebody who has a heart attack and needs some time off, and they would probably put in a form. So you should use your same process that you use for other requests for accommodation as you do for COVID-19. Might want to dust that policy off and fix it a little bit, but that's it. But in general, the obligation is on the employee to establish why they need that exemption and to provide appropriate documentation. And there's a great article, I'll try to send it to you in the Toronto Star, that really you should say it should be a physician or a nurse practitioner who certifies that you're not able to take the vaccine. Now, I know there's like regulated naturopaths and regulated chiropractors who are, at least early on, were writing mask exemptions. And they may also be writing vaccine exemptions. And I personally would not accept that because I don't know what the most legitimate vaccine exemption is. Actually, one is an allergy, or B is an underlying medical condition that's not stable, and right now is not the right time. So it's not a forever you won't be vaccinated, but right now is you can't get vaccinated. Those should come from doctors. And I've made it clear that if I think it's one of those, give me $50 and I'll give you a note type of things, that those will be reported to the College of Naturopaths or College of Chiropractors, because it should be based upon a proper evaluation of the person's underlying medical condition. So if you're feeling that you're being played, you can be much more aggressive. And often some of our listeners will be insured through some kind of health and dental plan. It's often a really good, if your carrier has some advisory services, they can sometimes assess the legitimacy of these medical notes. So when people know that their note is going to be properly assessed, it does actually reduce the number of silly notes.
Got it. Thank you for that. There's a couple here that I think relate to accommodation in the workplace. So should we accommodate those who have concerns about their family's health? So they have, a partner at home who is compromised, or, accommodate people who are just not wanting to come back to work and are kind of using this, back to the office, and are just kind of using this as a way to avoid doing that. Any comments there around?
Yeah, it's really hard at that level of generality to actually give a specific answer, but I would say work through the accommodation process and try to really figure out whether this is a medically necessary restriction. In other words, as the doctor said, for the safety of your loved one, not only you, but everybody else in this household should should minimize external contact. Because if that's the case, there may have a great argument. The other thing is there may be care needs. Remember, we also have to, it's not just disability, we also have to accommodate for family status. So if people are taking care of a child or taking care of a parent or taking care of a loved one, there may be family care types of accommodation that we would have to think about. So I would say work through the process that you have set in your firm. Christina, a friend of mine always says, consistency is your friend. So whatever process you have for working through those issues previously, use that same process to work through this issue with some compassion that people are dealing with some very difficult situations and figuring out how we can make that work.
Perfect. Another question here. What are some of the best strategies to deal with decisiveness around vaccines, especially affecting, certain teams, colleagues, or leadership?
That's a really difficult one because, to my surprise, vaccination and even COVID-19 and the seriousness of COVID-19 has become like a real entrenched issue. People are entrenched in their positions. And so what I would say is we can try to focus and work, assure people that we are really trying to do what we believe based on the evidence is the right thing, and avoid demonizing people who are on the other side. I mean, there are people who are genuinely very concerned about vaccinations and very concerned about, the unknown. And I don't agree with them, but I can respect that they're coming from a place that is genuine, that goes a long way. Now, we may make different decisions, but if you at least don't, demonize people, and some of these can't be squared. Like at some point in time, you may have this is the company's decision, and it's sort of like, decisions about companies about whether or not they should take on an investor or whether they should sell. I mean, these are fundamental decisions, and sometimes the person who doesn't agree just has to find a place that is more holistic to them, and realize that that's a choice that they're making. Like sometimes you can't square the circle.
Got it. Thank you. If we can just take a minute to talk about travel and employees who are required to travel as part of their, position or job. Is there any liability exposure to the company to having people travel? Any special considerations or guidance that you have there?
Oh yeah, travel's a really interesting one. So first of all, if people are traveling for business and you have, let's say, WSIB coverage, it's quite possible that if they catch COVID during their travels while they were executing their duties, they may have a legitimate claim to say that should be a compensable time off or compensable injury. So that, yes. So what I would recommend is you create based on best practices. You may, of course, the negative COVID test as you cross the border. You may want to encourage people not to come into the office until they get a second COVID test. That's a little bit outside of my expertise because you're trying to design something that is consistent with the current learnings about what's the right protocols for COVID-19. But yes, you can create those kinds of procedures based upon the best advice at the time. And theoretically, there could be some liability if people get sick during the course of their exercises, typically a WSIB liability, though.
Any guidance around, employees who are traveling for their own personal vacation or that sort of thing, and guidance around, how much time they should, quarantine at home, or, what policy should be put into place if they choose to travel on personal time?
Right. So it does, the current thinking is that if people are double vaccinated, they actually don't need to quarantine on return from international travel. But there is nothing saying that we as employers can say, you know what, just work from home for, 2 weeks. And if I could just give one more shout out, is that many of the companies on this call have less than 150 employees. And so they're eligible to participate in that, the free rapid antigen testing kits that are being distributed throughout the province through various chambers of commerces and Communitech. And so I would recommend that you consider some kind of testing regime. Now, maybe somebody comes back, whether it's personal travel or business travel, but they can't come back into the office unless they have a X number of days and a clean rapid antigen test. And that's a very logical thing to require.
Perfect. A couple last questions here. I know we're almost out of time. Are you allowed to ask your coworkers for their vaccination status? So not from a workplace standpoint, but on a personal note. So can employee to employee ask that question? I think we covered, whether or not an employer can share that. But can you ask your coworker if they've been vaccinated?
Absolutely. You can ask your coworker. Your coworker doesn't have any obligation to answer the question. But what I've found is that the vast majority of people, we're all muddling through, but they will, will say something like, yes, I'm vaccinated, and very enthusiastic about that. Or, well, I'm not comfortable with the vaccination. And then in terms of, I think the question is, well, what can I decline to meet? Well, if it's a personal meeting, that's a personal choice. So if you want to come to Shea Gupta and drink champagne and nibblies, I'm expecting you to be double vaccinated. That's a personal thing. That's not a work thing. The issue is much more interesting is what if the work mandates a meeting? And then I would say, I'm not sure you do have that personal right. I think it's much more appropriate to raise the concern at the workplace to make sure all the other, safety measures are put in place in a way that assuages all those concerns.
Thank you. A couple last questions here on, the requirement to be vaccinated if you're on site. So would testing, I'm assuming they mean here like the rapid testing, be a good alternative to requiring employees to be vaccinated?
Yeah, there's a lot of companies that are doing the vaccine or test regime. And we actually see that in the long-term care setting where there's a lot of vulnerable people. And I think at that time, this is a really vulnerable setting, right? So you have people who are elderly or dying. And I think the cadence there is you can prove you're fully vaccinated or you do the rapid antigen testing every other day. And that would be, I think, a perfectly logical way of trying to balance the vaccine risk for the rapid antigen test. Interestingly, we have a little bit of case law on that. It's not from the courts, it's from labor arbitrators because unions have gone and objected to these policies or expressed concerns. There's now 3 decisions which have essentially said rapid antigen testing is a fair way of balancing the risks of COVID-19 and ensuring safety, and all arbitrators through various complicated means have essentially supported rapid antigen testing in the workplace.
Yeah, I know at Communitech, that's one of the 5 strategies that we're using to protect employees and our families and community. Couple of last questions here. Are there any key caveats to consider before requiring individual employees on site to be fully vaccinated? So as a takeaway from today, what are some key things you should consider before making that policy mandatory?
So one thing is, I think your communication strategy. I know this is an Ask Me Anything legal thing. But really, that this is the best way of helping your workplace stay safe. And then also inviting, making it clear you will accommodate and be very upfront how that information is going to be used. And above all, opening up channels of communication so people can really express their concerns about why they don't want to do it and not feel like they're going to get demonized or shunted into the corner. And there's some really good information or best practices in some of the Communitech material that might inspire you on that. But there's what we've seen in the last, I would say 10 days, like it's not been, is essentially corporate Canada saying, we are tired of waiting for the governments to make the right decision, right? Justin Trudeau, federally regulated employers, and their mandatory vaccine is really a mandatory vaccine or test policy. And essentially was intended to nudge employers to make that decision. Dr. Davila in Toronto, any Toronto-based company needs to have a vaccination policy of some sort. And so what I would recommend is, essentially what we're seeing is corporate Canada saying, you know what? We're sick and tired of the politicians, dithering and worrying about votes and catering to certain groups and not catering to other groups. We're making decisions that are right for us so that we can stay open for business. Because the one thing, whether you're a pro-vax, anti-vax, vaccine hesitant, whatever the word is, none of us want to go back to being fully locked down like we were. Like, I think we've just had it. I'm COVIDed out, Christina. I'm pretty sure the one thing we agree about is that everyone's COVIDed out. I know we're close to the hour, so I want to be respectful of time. I'm wondering, I have some slides. I'm not going to go through them, but it'll just show, where you can get more information. I want to actually give a shout out to my Gowling's colleagues. They work very hard to get newsletters and send out updates on a regular basis. So I'm going to invite you guys, if you're interested in more information, to subscribe to the gowling.com update section and check up COVID-19 and employment law so we can give you more information. And hopefully you found our chat useful.
Yeah, so Lori, if you can put Neena's resource slide up for us, that would be great. And we will also, as I mentioned, follow up in our post-event email with all of the resources that we referred to today, Communitech's microsite, our FAQ. And if we didn't get to one of your questions, please reach out to your Communitech CSM or advisor, and we're happy to connect you with the right person to get you the answer to that question. We want to make sure we got to everybody's questions and did the best we could today. So in the hour. So Neena, I'll turn it back over to you to kind of just talk through some of these resources, and then we'll wrap up.
Absolutely. So on the first slide, which is slide 7 on my deck, but you can tell I didn't go through the entire deck, are governmental resources that are very useful. And we put it in one place because it's just too difficult to do Google searches and figure out what's the right resource. The one that people often use is that very first one, the Government of Canada COVID-19 Travel, Testing, Quarantine and Borders. That changes weekly, so I really recommend that people who are considering business travel have that as a favorite. The other one is the second from the bottom, which is the Ontario Human Rights Code. There's a Q&A because I think people sometimes have a broader view of what human rights are than actually applies to the Ontario workplace. Interestingly, in Quebec, I think they might actually have a better argument. And then I don't know if I have the second, is there an additional slide on resources? So I've also put in the Canadian Chamber of Commerce as an excellent vaccine resource hub. So I recommend it highly. And then of course, because I'm from Gowling's and I'd get fired if I didn't put a plug in for our own resources, I've given you some resources that you guys might find useful, and at the bottom where you can subscribe, and I recommend that you join us and get our information, and it's all free, and you can always unsubscribe. We try not to spam you, I promise.
Okay, so Neena, I just want to give you a huge thank you for walking us through all of this information today. I can imagine it is so difficult to stay on top of the latest and greatest in this ever-changing environment. So thank you. You did a wonderful job, and we love having you here with us. So, and thank you for pulling those resources together. And so with that, there is about 30 minutes left. If people want to stay back and chat amongst your tables, find out what other companies are doing, talk to other, HR folks or people in your field, and get a sense of where people are having challenges or where you might be able to pick up what other people are working on. So I invite you to stay and share if you have the time. But if not, that ends our presentation for today. So again, thank you to Gowling's, thank you to our partners at Invest Ottawa and Mars for running the follow-on sessions. And we will share an email with all of these resources for you. So thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Bye, Christina.
Bye, Neena.
Bye.